There are many ways to consider the nervous system. It's very difficult. You want to classify it physically and say, here is where this is, here is where this is. But the reality is that we know more about the function of it, and we're going to learn more about the function of it than its physical structure. So its purpose, its function is to control and communicate other things in your body, like skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. We're going to divide the nervous system at first. We're going to divide it into two sections. We're going to start with the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. So we're going to look at those two structures, brain, spinal cord. And we're also going to look at the peripheral nervous system, which I love the definition of it. It's everything but the brain and spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system is all of our spinal nerves, like the sciatic nerve, and all of our cranial nerves, like the trigeminal or the facial nerve. These are all things that are outside of the central nervous system. Okay, so the cells of the nervous system that are the smallest structures that can control and communicate, they're called neurons, right? We had muscle fibers for the skeletal system. We had osteocytes and other things. I'm sorry, for muscular. We had osteocytes and other things for the skeletal system. Here we have neurons for the nervous system. And in terms of controlling and communicating, what they do is they conduct electricity from one part of your body to another. And we're going to constantly use the example of conducting electricity from a neuron in your brain, down your spinal cord, out the sciatic nerve, down your leg, to your big toe. Neurons live forever. And they can repair themselves, but they usually don't like to do mitosis. They don't like to just completely make a new one of themselves. So this is why neural injuries are sometimes permanent, like traumatic brain injury and peripheral nerve injury. Yeah. Neurons require lots of glucose and lots of oxygen. And in fact, when you are resting, and then if you get up and exercise, your neurons will retain the same amount of glucose and oxygen. Your body does not sacrifice the glucose and oxygen that goes to your brain. It always gets the same amount. And this is why when you study, you should eat something. All right, this is the structure of a neuron. And we can draw this in certain ways. You know, I usually draw this, it's something like a sideways palm tree. So if you're drawing it, you can do something like this with me. And yeah, bring the line down like a tube and branch off. So that's the structure of a neuron. Let's start with these things out here. Over here on the bottom, we've labeled the dendrites, and they're kind of like arms that are coming off of this big cell body, right? So this big structure in here, that's like what you would know as the cell, right? It contains the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and very specifically, it has these things called Nissl bodies. And what they are is really just the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but they take up a stain very specifically. And it's these structures that are making neurotransmitters. These structures are making proteins, and your neurotransmitters are mainly proteins. So they're getting made here, just like skin cells would make melanin. Okay, there's a couple words here. This structure right here is called the axon hillock. I know, hill. We're just going to keep it in mind. It's kind of like a neck. So let's think of it as a neck. The big, long tether that's moving down here, this is called the axon. And actually, That's what's traveling through your body. So let's take a moment here and ask where this is in your body. Here's your brain, here's your spinal cord, here's the cell body right here in your frontal lobe. And the axon goes all the way down your spinal cord, out it, and down to whatever muscle it's controlling. You can also have a neuron that connects to another neuron in the brain, but that's where this axon is, right? There, it's running through nerves and distributing in your peripheral nervous system. The axon has its own plasma membrane, and we give it its own name, axolemma, right? Remember we had sarcolemma for muscle cells? So axolemma, this is just a plasma membrane, a specific name for it. Okay, moving further down the neuron, we have, okay, this is what I say. We have these things called teleodendria, and they're kind of like toes. And then at the very ends of them, we have something that's called an axon terminal. So the teleodendria are like these toes here, right? And the very, very end of it is what's called the axon terminal. We've seen this word before, right? This is the edge of the neuron where it kind of connects with another structure. And here in this picture, you can see that this neuron we drew connects to another neuron. We've talked about neurons connected to muscle fibers previously, but now we're talking about neurons connecting to other neurons. Okay, all right. I'm talking about action potentials here, right? Action potentials are thoughts or impulses. It's electricity that moves through your body causing action. So let's just remind ourselves again. Here's your brain, here's your spinal cord, and you have a neuron that has its cell body up here, and it descends your spinal cord and goes out to another structure. Okay, so neurotransmitters are made up here in the cell body, right? Those Nissl bodies make them because they're proteins. And then neurotransmitters are transported all the way down the axon to the toes and the edges of them, the axon terminal. So this movement that this arrow is showing you right here, this is what is called anterograde. This is also the movement for action potentials and the movement for neurotransmitters. This is a commonly used pathway, anterograde. You can have things move retrograde. You can. And that's when things move from the axon terminals to the cell body. Let's say we break a neurotransmitter. It might run this. We might bring it back to the cell body to repair it. Unfortunately, there are some viruses that can enter the central nervous system by moving retrograde up neurons, and rabies is one of those. I don't want you to associate retrograde with bad things, but I'm just letting you know that rabies moves retrograde. Rabies. This is what nervous tissue looks like. I mean, we can draw that nice little picture of the sideways palm tree all day, but let's be honest, it's a mess in there. It's a tangled mess. Look at all these neurons. You can see the cell bodies. Maybe you can identify an axon here and there, right? But I mean, it's just like a big, huge mess of neurons. So this is taken from the central nervous system, so like from the brain. And remember, all of the yellow space behind it are those supportive cells, neuroglia, which are 50% of nervous tissue. So if you were to take a slice of brain, half of it would be neuroglia and half of it would be neurons. Neurons have a covering on their axon called a myelin sheath. So let's look at this picture right here for a moment. Look down here at the bottom. We've got a cell, a neuron that we drew, And it's showing you that we're going to cut it right here in the axon. And this little pill that's surrounding it is the myelin sheath. So now take a look at this picture up on the top right. In the center, this is the axon, and the myelin sheath surrounds it out here. So, okay, what exactly is myelin? It's a lipid. It's a fatty substance. It's like a covering on an electrical wire. It's non-conductive. It refuses to take the electricity. Officially, what does myelin do? Let's use some big words here. It covers ion channels in the axolemma. What we're saying is that it smothers the plasma membrane of the axon. Remember, axolemma is plasma membrane of the axon. It smothers them. So if you have a channel that allows sodium to move through, it won't do that. It's smothered. If you have a channel that allows potassium, it won't do, it's smothered. Myelin is, as you recall, myelin is made by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, and it's made by oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. So two different cells doing the same thing, but in different places. What does it mean for a neuron to be covered in myelin? All right, so let's take a picture. Let's take a look at this picture here. We have a myelin, a neuron on the bottom, right? We can see the cell body and its axon extending to the right. And we don't see any myelin, no pillows on the axon. So this is what is called an unmyelinated axon. Okay, those exist in your body. There's lots of them in your brain. On the top, we have a neuron that has an axon that has myelin wrapping around it. So this is a myelinated axon. And that might be like a neuron that runs down your sciatic nerve would be myelinated. Okay, so the myelin doesn't cover the axon completely. If you look here, the myelin makes these little pillows that have little open spaces between them. I'm not drawing it very well, but it has little open spaces between them. So these little open spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. These are areas where the myelin is not smothering the axon channels. So these are areas where if sodium wants to flow in and out of the neuron, it will. But where the myelin is, if sodium wants to flow, it will not. So a node of Ranvier is where the axolemma is exposed between myelin. So you can't talk about myelin without talking about these nodes of Ranvier, because the way that myelin covers an axon, it creates these little open spaces, these little gaps, right? And the sodium and potassium channels are accessible. Where myelin is, they're covered by the myelin, and they're not able to let ions flow in and out. All right, so we haven't really talked about action potentials yet specifically, but let's understand something that happens. When you have a myelinated neuron, what you get is an action potential that starts up here as a thought, and then as it moves down the axon, it gets to the myelin, and it's like, I can't move through, you're smothering things, and it jumps. And then it's like, I can't move through this myelin, and then it jumps. And it jumps, and the action potential jumps from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier. Right now, move your toe. As an action potential moves down your sciatic nerve, there's a neuron that's smothered with myelin and is allowing this action potential to jump. And this is what is called saltatory, which saltare means to jump, propagation. All right, I taught from another book for many years that called this saltatory conduction. Conduction or propagation is when an action potential moves from the cell body down the axon. So basically it's a thought, and it jumps, bing, 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 bing. The unmyelinated neuron on the bottom has continuous propagation. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, when an action potential gets created up here, it starts to move down the axon and it has to move through every single channel in the axon. And this takes a really long time. So I think of it like this. When you go to the supermarket when you were a kid, and if you just jumped on the colored tiles on the floor, that's like saltatory propagation. And you would kind of like jump on each of them and make it to the end of an aisle very quickly. Continuous propagation is when you have to step on every single tile, right? That takes a long time. So it doesn't mean that unmyelinated axons are bad. They just span very small spaces. I just want to talk about MS for a minute. Multiple sclerosis is the degradation of the myelin sheaths. Multiple sclerosis takes neurons that did saltatory and turns them into continuous propagation. So it takes longer. And you're like screaming at your feet to move, and the action potential, it just never gets there. Neurons have different shapes, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this is not a worthwhile way of classifying neurons. I mean, it's better to classify them about function and like where they're carrying their action potentials, but there are differently shaped neurons. The two that we will see most commonly in this class are multipolar neurons, which are common in the central nervous system. They also are often our motor neurons. And unknowingly, we've been drawing multipolar neurons when I draw my silly picture of a brain, your little brain, and your spinal cord. This is a multipolar neuron. Here's its cell body. And the axon extends out into some kind of muscle. That's a multipolar neuron. We have not drawn unipolar neurons. And unipolar neurons, we'll see them again. They are most often sensory neurons. And so they bring information into the brain. Let's draw a brain, this, and the spinal cord. And what they do is they take information in the environment, and here's their cell body. And then they bring it up into the brain. So their cell body is like kind of in the middle. We'll discuss where it is. But different structure, different function. I want you to focus on the function. Neurons are classified by function. I want you to be able to look at any picture and understand what's going on with abbreviated drawings of neurons. Okay, so this picture here is showing you how information travels from some sensory structure like the eye, and then it travels up a neuron into the central nervous system. A decision is made, and that decision travels out of the central nervous system to a muscle, and it makes you pick up the glass. This neuron here is sensory. Look at its structure. Look at how it's drawn, right? So it seems to have all of its feelers, and then it comes up here to a neuron in the central nervous system. Here, there's its cell body. And that neuron in the central nervous system is called an interneuron. Interneurons are the name of neurons in the central nervous system. There's another neuron here, and it has its cell body in the central nervous system, but it leaves the central nervous system and travels out through the peripheral nervous system. And those are called motor neurons. So this classification you'll find is much more useful. We'll be talking about sensory neurons and motor neurons. And they're obviously in your peripheral system, but they send and receive information to the central nervous system. It's all about getting to the hub, the central nervous system. Information that goes into the central nervous system is called afferent, and information that leaves the central nervous system is called efferent. These two words just mean into and out of. We will see these words again. especially with organs like the liver and the kidney.